And it's recording, yay. And it's especially important this week since a lot of people are going to depend on the recording. So good morning, everybody. Today we're going to finish up the amazing story of Honi, the circle maker, and reflect a little bit more on how the stories about him, or the stories about a miracle maker in general, how it reflects on a very tumultuous period in Eretz Israel, and a tumultuous period in general, when we talked about how it's just the beginning. When we talk about Antignos Ish Soho, Antignos, the guy from Soho, is coming right at the beginning of the Second Temple period, right when the Greeks have conquered this area, and just at the beginning of sort of the introduction of Hellenistic thought and ideas. And Antignos is really a reflection of that kind of beginning, the burgeoning of really questioning the relationship between humans and the divine, the relationship between this world and the heavenly spheres, questioning and trying to understand the world to come, Tchiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead, and the rabbis all along trying to balance between a lot of these different points of view, and trying to take a kind of middle path, even though the rabbis, we call the rabbis Chazal, the Chachamim Zichronam Lebracha, the sages that we remember with a blessing. And sorry, someone's telling me that they can't make it. But the way that the rabbis sometimes call themselves in the Talmud, and in the Mishnah, not really in the Mishnah, but later in the Talmud, how the rabbis refer to themselves, and as later historians refer to themselves, as Prushim, the Pharisees. And Pharisee is usually meant with regard, as opposed to Sadducees, the Sadducees who we've been talking about. And the Sadducees were called the Sadducees because they were thought to have come from the high priest, the Kohen Gadol of Sadok, who was one of the early Kohen Gadols of one of the leading priests at the very beginning of the Second Temple. And the Sadducees, more or less, in terms of what we understand from the period and what we can pick out from the Talmud, the Sadducees really represent, there's like a nice Latin way of saying this, but I can't remember, like the Rege something, the sort of mainstream leadership institution, the old guard, the old, the gentleman's club. They represent the elite, the accepted leadership. They are seen as kind of the bridge between the First Temple and the Second Temple. And we're going to see today, when we get to the next Mishnah, once the Hashmonaim, once the Hasmoneans take over this area and wrest control of the area from Antiochus, the last Seleucid king to rule this area, the Hashmonaim really, in many respects, kind of support the Sadducee point of view. The Hashmonaim not only become the kings, or the leaders, really not really kings, but they call themselves kings, but they also have very good relationship with the Tzdukim, with the high priests, with the vanguard, and many of them find ways to buy their way into the priesthood. We always think of the priesthood as something that's inherited, but it becomes very much the elite, the aristocracy, the rich and the wealthy can wield power by buying their way into it. So the rabbis see themselves as somewhat rebellious, which is interesting for us to think of it that way, because when we look at Chazal, we think of it as, this is normative, this is the kind of foundations of our our practice. When we think of modern Israel and we think of the rabbinate, we don't think of them as rebellious. You don't think of the people in Bnei Brak as, as somehow fighting against the institutions. But in their time, they were really the heroes of the Amcha. They were very, very well respected by and large by the masses, because why, as my kids would say, because they represent the anti-elite. They represent the movement against the buying of power. They represent the movement against the aristocracy. And it's really an interesting thing for us to think about, because we tie Chachamim in with the Beit Midrash and learning and reading, right, and education. But they saw themselves as both. They saw themselves as the academic elite, but they also saw themselves as representing the simple folk, and really finding ways to make sure that, following what we learned about Ezra and the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, making sure that the typical Jew had a way to connect to Judaism that was outside of the Beit HaMikdash, that was outside of Jerusalem, and that could be accomplished in someone's home and in the Beit Knesset. So that is all kind of just trying to set the stage for the fact that they're called Prushim, which means, in English, we call them Pharisees, which comes from the word poresh, which means to separate. Poresh minat tzibor, to separate oneself from the community. And really the source of that is the fact that they were responding, they were separating themselves from the elite. They were separating themselves from what then was the mainstream. So that is all a way of trying to give some reka, some background for what the rabbis are trying to do when they are challenged and when they are trying to make sense of the ideologies that are springing up around them. And you can see it in the Gemara, and that's what makes it so fascinating, because at this time, they're also canonizing the Tanakh. They're canonizing what we include as holy books. So what is considered a holy book? Is Shir Shirim, which is a love song, is that a holy book? And so you can see their reactions to philosophy, to science at the time, in the way that they begin to open and close the door of what is considered, what they would consider normative Judaism. And so we have the story of Honi and the real discomfort that we went through last week. Here we tied in rain with the importance of rain, and how in all over the Torah and all over Tanakh, we see that rain is connected to blessing. And so when rain is withheld, the sense is that blessings are withheld. We have a limitation on parnassah. We have a limitation on being able to support ourselves, to be able to survive. Although, Julie, I thought it was interesting in today's daf that it referred to Rabbah and Rav Chisda, who were two people who were able to bring the rain. One was Rav Chisda was very wealthy, and Rabbah was not. Rabbah was really poor. And we see that time and time again, also in the Gemaras, people who are able to bring the rain, people who have keys to the rain, but don't necessarily have that connection to parnassah, to wealth, to shefa, to blessings. And so I also feel like that's also a response to the mainstream thinking. But going back to Honi, we have a situation where no rain has come, and in desperation, the rabbis turn to Honi, the circle maker. And we won't go through the whole story again, because I want to focus on the last part of his story. But the first part of the story, we see a lot of signs that Shimon ben Shetach, who is the Av Beit Din, and then eventually the Nasi now we're jumping to the middle of the Second Temple period, really right smack in the middle, and we're going to revisit Shimon ben Shetach in a few weeks, is really uncomfortable with Honi. So the first thing that we saw was, it's already Pesach, right? According to the story. And obviously there hasn't been rain yet. Why did they wait so long to go to the guy who they knew could bring the rain? And then Shimon ben Chetach says very outright, he says, if you were not Honi and I didn't know, and we all didn't recognize the fact that you have such a close relationship with God, I would excommunicate you. I would nadui, I would put you into excommunication. And so we were trying to grapple with, here's a guy, he got you what you wanted. We were about to enter into a drought. We were about to enter into Passover with destroyed crops. And you pulled this guy in and he got you what you wanted. What's the problem? And so we started to talk about, well, what are the problems? First of all, we saw that in the Talmudic rendition of that story, Honi compares himself, or he is compared to a prophet. And we know that prophecy has ended. And the rabbinic perspective is there is no prophecy. So acknowledging yourself as a prophet is a real problem in the Second Temple. Second, we already have noted that in the context of Masechet Ta'anit, in the context of the tractate Ta'anit that talks about rain, what are the solutions for lack of rain that are given in Masechet Ta'anit? Nowhere do we see, well, the perfect solution to lack of rain is draw a circle, stand in the middle, and beseech God, from that circle. That's what Honi does, right? What are the recipes that Chazal, that the Pharisees give for getting rain? Prayer and fasting, communal prayer and communal fasting. And so that is the rabbinic response to lack of rain. And you have droughts that happen, and the question is, how do you respond to that? And so it's not only at the very ultimate end that the rabbis pull in Honi to do his miracle making, but it's a really uncomfortable position for the rabbis, because here they are trying to, what we talked about last week, trying to maintain a perspective of using our direct communication with God, using the tools, not korbanot, not miracles, but using the words of prayer and using acts like mitzvot and fasts to affect the upper worlds, to affect the heavenly realm. And so there's a real discomfort in saying, oh, at the end of the day, we have to depend on a miracle, because at the end of the day, miracles are as random as prayers, and miracles interfere with that very entrenched philosophy that the rabbis are trying to promote, which is that we have the tools in our hands to affect what happens to us and to affect what happens in our world and to have a relationship with God. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. It doesn't mean that Honi's miracles are going to happen, but it empowers each person to have that power rather than giving power to the miracles themselves. So let's pick up there and start to look at, continue to look at some of these sources. So the first one I'm going to pull up, sorry, let me just close this so you guys don't have to see that. Oh, I just lost a source. It's all right, we'll find it. Okay, so let's just move this up, and I'm gonna actually make this smaller so you can see the Hebrew and the English together. Okay, we also saw this connection last week between Honi Hamagel and Eliyahu and Elijah the prophet. The story goes that Elijah the prophet, we know from the book of Kings, a very fiery, very energetic, charismatic character who causes a drought. He returns the key of rain to God. And we learn in Tractate Ta'anit that there are 3 keys that God does not give to people anymore: fertility, resurrection of the dead, and the main one, rain. And the Midrash says that it was Elijah who returned that key. Elijah had the key and he returned it. And we see the power of Elijah and Honi. First, Honi comparing himself to a prophet, not to Elijah, but the rabbis themselves compare Honi and Elijah. When we looked at Breshit Rabbah, and I'm sorry, I don't have this in English, when there's this this idea, Va'adam ein la'avida et habriot la'kadosh baruch hu. People are not able to bring, a person is not able to bring people like Kiruv, bringing people closer to God, like Eliyahu and like Honi HaMagel. They were two people who could bring the masses closer to God. Why? And this is, I think, what Shimon ben Shattach is referring to. Why? Because because they had the power of miracles. They were powerful people that clearly had a relationship with God, and there's something very attractive about that. So you can see the source, both the wonderment and the source of Shimon ben Shattach's discomfort with Honi, because if you have that power to do miracles and bring people closer to God, how strong is that connection going to be? You know, people become addicted to miracles. They become reliant on them. They become passive in their own action because they expect someone to eventually come around and do a miracle for them. And so the fact that there's a wonderment to Eliyahu and Honi is also a problem. And I wanted to actually share another perspective on that. Let me just pull up this page, and hopefully you can see that as well. One second. Let me just put this at 100% as well. And I wanted to just highlight this because it actually—
I think you need to do new share. Did you do new share?
Okay, stop share. Okay, thank you. And I'm going to new share. I thought that I could just be clever and just put it in the same screen. Apparently not. Okay, now you can see it, right? Thank you. So this was actually just something I came across when I was trying to put up the full source that we're going to look at, which is here's another, at the end of the passage where Honi makes the circle, stands in the circle and brings rain. They start to actually, Shimon ben Shattach says, I would have thrown you into excommunication. I would have excommunicated you, but I didn't because you're Honi. But that's said in the context of other statements that the rabbis then say, or that the people then say about Honi. The Tigzar Omer, this is just a quote from a pasuk, like saying, this is how great Honi is. Ata gazarta milamata v'kadosh baruch hu makayem ma'amarcha milamala. You decreed from below. I mean, this is, think about this, right? When we talk about a gzerah, when we talk about a decree, we usually talk about a heavenly decree. God has decreed from above and it affects us below. But what do they say about Honi? Honi decrees from below, v'kadosh baruch hu mekayem ma'amarcha milamala. And God accepts Honi's decree above, v'al darkecha naga or, and the light shall shine upon your ways. Dor shaya afel he'arta b'tfilatecha. A generation that was sunk into darkness, thrown into darkness. You he'arta, you brought light with your prayers. And that's a really significant statement, and I think is really highlighting the source of the discomfort with this image of a miracle worker. What that means that someone has the power to make a gzerah down here, and it's not just that God listens, but God mikayem, God is forced to accept it. And that's really turning the tables in terms of the divine human relationship that we're used to in the Torah and in the Tanakh. So it's a really remarkable statement that, you know, I want you to sit with for a little bit. The other thing I want to point out is I really like this phrase, Dor shehaya afel he'arta b'tfilatecha, a generation that was made dark in. Oh, Liz, if you want to share that on the chat, you know, towards the end. My daughter also did a painting of Honi HaMagel. Maybe I'll try to find it and and bring it out when she was 13 or 12, I guess. But this idea, Dor shahaya afel he'arta b'tfilatecha, what does that remind you of? And can you remember the source that we looked at last week from the Yerushalmi? And I'll pull it up here. A generation that was plunged into darkness, you he'arta, you brought light with your prayers. And so here I'll be fancy again and pull up last week's source sheet so we can just take a quick look. So the idea of enlightening a generation, and what source does that remind you of? I put it up here. It's a spoiler alert. So today we're going to look at, last week and the week before, we looked at, there are two very famous stories about Honi, and they repeat themselves in the Yerushalmi and in the Bavli. So we have it in the Jerusalem Talmud, and we also have it in the Babylonian Talmud, and we have it in Midrashim, and we have it in lots of different places. The first story we finished unpacking, it's the story of how Honi brought rain by drawing a circle and by beseeching God. We unpacked that last week. We showed that it showed up in the Mishnah, it showed up in the Bavli, again in the Gemara, and then it also shows up earlier in the Yerushalmi, which, you know, the Gemara for the Yerushalmi is probably earlier than the Gemara for the Bavli. And it also shows up in the Yerushalmi and the Mishnah, of course, because it's the same Mishnah. And it shows up in Midrashim. So in the Yerushalmi, I think that, Sarah, go ahead. You are raising your hand.
Thank you. I have a question. I'm going back a minute to the issue of the Gezerah. Who declared, and under, in what understanding was it declared that what Honi had done was a Gezerah? I mean, the way I see it, he just prayed. He might have created a little bit of a, you know, a magical, what do you call it, scenario around it. But essentially what he did was he prayed. And we like to think that the Almighty is aware that we pray. And sometimes he gives us the answers that we're praying for. He gives us good answers. Sometimes he doesn't answer. Sometimes there's a bad answer. But I don't understand the difference between prayer that is kind of ritualized in this scenario of Honi and how that's different from any other prayer and why it was called a Gezerah.
Okay, so really good question. First of all, just to put that little snippet into context, I didn't bring the whole discussion in the Gemara, but what happened is after Honi's miracle, the people and the rabbis, but it just says everyone started to quote psukim from the Torah, including the Gezerah pasuk, and tied it into Honi. So it's meant more in a literary poetic way. In other words, it wasn't meant to be, this is literally what happened. It was saying ki'ilu. It was as though Honi forced God's hand with a Gezerah. That's how powerful what Honi did, what he did. Now, what was the difference between simple prayer and what Honi did? Aside from the magic, right? There was the circle. First thing, the rain actually came, and it hadn't come up until now, even though everybody was praying and fasting. So whatever he did was actually working. The second thing is, if you remember the story, do you remember that element of the story? He is very demanding. First, he demands the rain, and the rain comes too lightly. And he says, that's not what we want. We want proper rain. And so the rain then comes in buckets in a storm. And he says, no, that's not what we want. We want proper rain. And then the rain came. And then the rabbis come to him and say, now you have to tell God to stop the rain. And he says, I'll do it, but you're really not supposed to do that. That's really crossing the line. And that's where the whole discussion comes, where you don't say, stop the rain, even if it's too much. Like last week, we're like, just stop the rain. No, you don't say that. You don't ever say that's too much rain. But I think that that's what the Gzeirah is a reference to. In other words, the idea that when something is, when someone beseeches God in their prayers, it's basically like, I'll take any help I can get. And Honi, that's why Shimon ben Chetach calls him a spoiled child, because he doesn't, first of all, he doesn't tell anybody to do anything. He doesn't tell anybody, you should pray with me, or you should fast with me, or you should come in the circle with me. He doesn't make it into a communal activity like the rabbis do. The only thing he tells people is bring in your clay ovens, because they're going to get ruined in the rain, which is just showing his bravado and thinking whatever I do will happen. So that's, I think, where the sense of, it's a Gzeirah insofar as not technically a Gzeirah, but he was demanding and God had no choice but to do it. God in this case was powerless. It was Honi who had the power.
Well, it seems, thank you, but it seems to me that I know I'm going backwards, but I've been thinking about this a lot. And I just think Shimon ben Shetach, he tried, he failed, Honi came along, he succeeded. This is almost like professional jealousy.
And well, I actually think that you're correct in that way, right? Because that's what I'm trying to set up here, is that this is a very dramatic period of time, right? There's the end of prophecy. There's a temple that is meant to be a central institution, but where the people who are running the temple have been overreaching in terms of their power over the country, over the nation.
Yeah.
You've got these upstart rabbis who are saying, we have the secrets of Torah understanding. You should be learning it from us. And in fact, we're going to teach it to you. Whereas the Kohanim are saying, no, we're going to keep it secret in the Beit HaMikdash. And Honi, in many respects, right, he's not just a miracle worker. He also is keeping his methods secret. Again, if you think about the fact, he draws that circle and he's the only one standing in there. He doesn't say, let's all hold hands and dance a hora in a circle. He says, no, I'm the only one who can affect this. And I'm going to do it by myself. And again, he doesn't say, let's all go give a korban. Let's all fast. Let's all pray. He says, oh, I'll take care of this. It's very individual. It's like the Kohen Gadol, right? Like, I've got the power. I'm going to do it. And so there's a lot of, I think that there's definitely a power play going on here. Shimon ben Chetach is not happy at all that this worked. Mm-hmm. And I bet that he's not happy about what people say about the Gzeirah.
Right.
I think that's the source of his discomfort. So I think you're picking up on, I think that, there are certain periods of history when the commotion of ideas floating around can really be seen in terms of the political and the power struggles happening. And so when you learn in school, Aristotelian philosophy and Plato and Platonic and the guy who drank hemlock, what's his name? The guy with an S, Socrates, you learn about Socrates, and you also learn about the rabbis, and you learn about, paganism and Zoroastrianism and the beginnings of Christianity. It all seems very far away. But at that time, it was happening and affecting people on a day-to-day basis, on a very, very human level. And I think we saw that from our earliest sources when we talk about Abraham and we talk about idolatry, right? Like we think, who cares? Like someone brings an idol to me, it doesn't mean anything to me. I could be just like Abraham, right? Like who cares? But at the time, it was such an attractive and popular and effective mode of seeing the world that to say we're going to be monotheists and we're not going to be idolatrous was like saying, I'm going to take away your smartphone. I'm going to take away everything that makes your life effective. I'm taking it away and you're just going to use your imagination. And that's hugely controversial. To us, it seems so matter of fact, but I think that we see parallel things happening with Honi and at this time during the Second Temple. Who has the power? And when you say who has the power, it's really who has that divine connection, who knows anything about the world.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It is dramatic. So I was wondering, so while if any of you were dozing off during that, did you have time to think about the connection between He'arta et Hador, enlightening the generation? Last week, we looked at the story of Honi, and in this case, according to the Yerushalmi, this is the story of Honi's grandfather. It's probably also Honi. I don't think there were that many people walking around with the name Honi, the circle maker. But again, we're talking about an image of a person. So there's Honi, our Honi's grandfather was alive at the destruction of the first temple. He falls asleep in his fields. He's a wealthy landowner. He goes out to visit his workers. And while he's visiting his workers, a tremendous storm of rain comes. Okay, so we see again the connection between Honi and water and prosperity, rain and prosperity. And he falls asleep, and he goes into a cave and falls asleep there for 70 years. And we talked about the significance of 70 years, and we're going to see it again. 70 is often referred to as a lifespan. In fact, we learned today if 50 or 60 is considered, not 70 is kind of the ideal age. And if you live past 70 to 80 or 90, then that's, considered strength and endurance. So Honi, this Honi falls asleep in a cave, and he wakes up, and lo and behold, everything is the same, but everything has changed. Instead of an olive field, now he's in a vineyard. And instead of vineyards, there are planted fruits, and everything, it's still fields, but everything has changed. And it becomes clear to him that he's been asleep for 70 years. And when he sees people, he says, what's going on in the world? And they say, how come you don't know? And he says, well, I'm Honi, the circle maker, and I must have fallen asleep. And they say, oh, we know about you. We never met you, but we know about you. There are legends that Honi, the circle maker, whenever he would come into the second temple, into the first temple, it would, the candelabrums and the lights in the courtyard would just, everything would become enlightened automatically, like a remote control. Everything turned on as soon as he came in. And lo and behold, he fell asleep just before the destruction of the first temple. He wakes up just as the second temple is being built. He walks in, like, you can imagine, his triumphant walk into this new temple. And lo and behold, what happens? Everything is enlightened. And then, and it says, Ve'anharata, sorry. He walks in and it's lit up. And then he understands what we mean by the verse, Et Shira Malot B'Shuv Hashem Et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kechomim. When God returned us to Zion, meaning when God brought us back to Zion at the time of Ezra and the time of the second temple, to build the second temple, we were like dreamers. Why? Because it had been like the 70 years either happened or it was a nightmare, and all of a sudden we wake up and there's the glory of the temple again. And how does Honi connect to that? Honi is the one who enlightens the temple. He's the one who brings the light. And that connects to the passage we just looked at, because what do the people say about the Gzerah, about the decree that Honi makes? It's as though his prayers have enlightened a darkened generation. So this is the way the Yerushalmi tells that second very famous story about Honi. The first story being about drawing the circle and bringing rain. The second story, the Rip Van Winkle story, about falling asleep for 70 years. Now I want to look at, so I'm going to stop share, and I want to look at the full story in the Bavli. Okay, so the story in the Here we go. And this you should see now. Okay. The story in the Yerushalmi that we just saw, everything kind of works out, right? If any of you are familiar with the story, the famous story we're going to look at, which is like every client environmentally focused person's dream. This story is like their dream, and it's like there's a gazillion Tu B'Shvat stories written about this famous story from the Bavli. But if we think back on the Yerushalmi story and afterwards we can actually look at them side by side. So Honi falls asleep for 70 years. And what's happened? It was 70 years, the destruction of the first temple he missed. And he wakes up and there's a second temple. It's like he's untouched, even though everything around him has changed. He's like a dreamer. He just kind of slumbers his way into this new reality. Now we see a very different story. And so let's start looking at the Bavli rendition of the story that comes later than the Jerusalem Talmud, the Yerushalmi story. Okay. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Yamav She'el Tot Tzadik Hayam Mitzte'er Al Mikra Zeh. In the context of talking about Honi the circle maker, Rabbi Yochanan, and remember Rabbi Yochanan is the same one. I'm going to just zoom up here. Sorry, I'm not going to zoom up there. That's a different source. He is the same one who said, we do not have the keys for rain. He was the one who said, there are 3 keys God keeps to himself, and one of them is rain. So that same Rabbi Yochanan has a story about Honi the circle maker. He calls him a tzaddik, right? He says, all the days of this righteous person, Haya mitzte'er al mikra zeh. He always wondered, Honi would always think about this line. Shira ma'alot b'shuv Hashem et shivat Zion hayinu kechomim. A song of ascents that the Levites used to sing at the temple. We have it in the book of Tehillim. B'shuv Hashem et shivat Zion hayinu kechomim. When God returned us to Zion, we were like dreamers. Now this should sound familiar to you. This is the proof text, the underlying text for the Jerusalem Talmud story that we just looked at. Same line. Same, different Honi, right? One says he's a grandfather, one says he's living in the time of the second temple, but basically the same. Amar mi ika denayim shivin shnim b'chama. Who can sleep? You know, he takes it very seriously. He's like, what? Who can sleep for 70 years? Where does he get the number 70? You know, I think he's thinking back on that original story that we think of 70 years as the time between the first temple and the second temple. And so he's thinking, you know, when the Jews came back at the second temple time, how are they like dreamers? They weren't the same people, right? They must have died. There must have been new people. Like, who sleeps like a dreamer for 70 years? So he's wondering about that. Yom echad hava azel ba'orcha. He was walking along the road. This Honi. Chazelahu gavra dehava nata charuva. And he came upon someone who was planting Amarle. Amarle, hi. Ad kamashnim taim. How long will it take for this tree to produce fruit? You know, you're planting a tiny little tree. I planted a lime tree before Shemitah. And, you know, I don't expect it to give limes for years. Well, it turns out the carob trees are even longer. It's 70 years, the guy says. It's going to be 70 years until this, you know, very convenient. Since we're talking about the number 70, it's going to be 70 years till this tree bears fruit. Amarle, pshita lach techayit shivin shnim. You're assuming it's obvious to you that you're going to live for another 70 years. Presumably this guy is probably 20, you know, or 30 or 40. You think you're going to live another 70 years to actually see this tree bear fruit? Amarle hi Gavra, this guy says to him, Alma becharuva ashkachate. I found the world populated with carob trees. When he says world, he obviously means, you know, his space, his area. Since I was a kid, I came into this world and I see carob trees. Ki hechi deshtalu li avati, shtali nami livrai. Just like my people, my grandparents planted trees for me, didn't know who I was, but they planted trees so I would have it. I'm planting it for my descendants. I'm planting it for the people who are going to come after me. Okay, everybody loves that story, right? It gets darker though, and a lot of people don't like to talk about the dark parts of this story. That whole idea of planting for the future is like a mainstay of modern Jewish thinking and environmental thinking, but it's often told without the next two parts. Yatev ka karich rifta. So Honi eats a sandwich and he falls asleep. Atele shinta, sorry, he falls asleep. Nim adrale mishunta. In the meantime, a cliff formed around him, a lot like that cave that formed around in the Yerushalmi story. It didn't form around him, but his grandfather found a cave to hide in. In this situation, a cliff kind of gets developed around him. And no one can see him. He's out of sight. He's protected. V'nim shivim shnim. Just like Rip Van Winkle, he sleeps 70 years. Kikam, chaze lelahu gavra, duhukam malkit minhu, amarle atu dishtante. He sees the same guy who was planting the carob tree when he fell asleep. And he feels like something's weird here. And he opens his eyes, he says, wait, are you the same guy who planted this tree? Amarle bar bareana. I'm his grandson. No, yes, I'm his son's son. I'm his grandson. So what's interesting here is the guy knows exactly who planted this tree, right? He's like, oh no, I didn't plant this tree. This is my grandfather planted it. Amarle, shma mina denaimi shivim shnim. I think I must have slept 70 years. How does he know he slept 70 years? When he went to sleep, it was just a tiny little sapling, and now it's a full-blown tree with carob fruits. I must have slept at least 70 years. He assumes 70, could have been more. And, here's a little humor in the Talmud. His donkey, in the last story, it was like all the fields changed places. Instead of a vineyard here, it's an olive orchard. Instead of an olive trees, it's a vineyard. In this story, it's a little bit of a joke. The donkey now has lots of little donkeys, and there's several herds of donkeys, and nobody, it's crazy, right? Nobody's left and wandered off. They're all just, just exactly where he's left them, the grandson of this guy with the carob tree, and here are all the donkeys. Then it becomes less funny. Alza lebete amar lehu, berei dechoni hamagel mikayam. He comes to his house. He gets over to his house, and the house is obviously still the same. He recognizes the house, and he says, "Is the son of Honi still alive?" Amrule bere leta bar bere ite. His son is no longer alive, but his grandson is alive. Now that's already getting pretty dark, right? Because he just missed the death of his child, and here there's grandchildren that he's never met before, and they don't know who he is. Amar lehu, ana Honi amagel. Okay, like his grandfather who walked into the Beit HaMikdash, and all of a sudden everything lights up. And it's sort of triumphant. He triumphantly says, "I am Honi amagel. I'm Honi the circle maker." And what happened? Circle maker, sorry. And Julie, one second, I'm going to just finish this passage, and then. And what happens? The worst thing that can happen, right? And especially to someone like Honi, la hemnuhu. They did not believe him. Okay. Azal Beit Midrash. He went to the Beit Midrash, and we don't hear stories about him in the Beit Midrash. Like, we don't think of him as a rabbi in that way, but he goes to the Beit Midrash. Sham'inhu l'Rabbanan de Kamre. Oh, actually, you know what? I rephrase that. We do have other mentions of Honi in the Talmud where people teach halachot based on things that he taught. So he obviously had some teaching and had some presence in the Beit Midrash. Sorry about that. So he comes into the Beit Midrash, Shaminu the Rabbanan de Kamri, and he hears the rabbis teaching, Nihiran Shmatanin Kivshnei Honi Hamagel. Anytime Honi would come into the Beit Midrash, all of our questions would be answered. all of our questions would be answered. And who does that remind you of, by the way?
Eliyahu Hanavi.
There you go.
Teku.
Teku, exactly. We have a phrase that all the kids in Israel say, teko, teko means tie. And then it comes from the Gemara, teku, which means that there's an argument between two schools of thought or two rabbis or multiple rabbis, and teku. It's a tie. We don't know who's right, and we just leave it at that. But some people say that it stands for shuvot, something about kol kushiyot shel. Do you know the Rashi Tevot? It means tishbi
Tishbi Yavo.
kol kushiyot.
Tishbi.
The Tishbi will answer all of our questions. Who is Tishbi? Eliyahu Hanavi. And there's this idea that in the world to come, eventually Eliyahu Hanavi, who never really died in Midrashic thoughts, will eventually come and answer all of our questions. Well, what do the rabbis say here? Yes.
I'm just saying the Rashi Tevot, sorry, I was on mute. Tishbi, Yitaret, Kushiot, Ubayot.
Thank you. Tishbi Yitaretz. Thank you so much. Tishbi Yitaretz, Kushiot, Ubayot. So teku. Now teko. Thank you. So Tishbi, we know from Zichron Yaakov, Tishbi is the name of Eliyahu Hanavi, and Eliyahu Tishbi. And so the idea is he will answer all questions. Well, what happens in our little passage is Nehiran Shamatin Kibishne Honi Amagel Dichi Have Aya Lebeit Midrasha Kol Kushya Dehavulahu LeRabbana Hava Mefarek Lahu. Every question that the rabbis would bring to him, Mefarek Lahu, he would tear it apart, meaning he would answer it, he would figure it out. It was like figuring out a puzzle. Amar Lahu Ananihu. Guess what? I'm that guy. I'm Honi. And what happens? La haimnuhu. They don't believe him. So twice he doesn't get believed. He doesn't get believed by his own family, and now he doesn't even get believed in his second home, the Beit Midrash. La avde le yikara d'mebaile. And they didn't, what does this mean? They didn't give him the proper respect. They didn't honor him as Honi. And I guess maybe if they had a question and he would have been able to solve the question, maybe they would have known he was Honi. But as it was, there's no proof he's Honi. They don't believe him. They're like, this is crazy talk. Chalash date. And he just became very upset. Ba rachame v'mit. He prayed for mercy, again, calling to God. And basically the words that aren't said here are he prays to die, and he dies. Meaning he couldn't exist in this new paradigm. He could not exist in what was going on. Amar Rava, hainu de amri inshe, o chavruta o mituta. And Rava, and I just want to say here, there are scholars who say this was added later, that this actually wasn't part of the story, but it's interesting that somewhere along the way, some editor decided this would be a good end of the story, which is either friendship or death, but it still has some context for the story, right? Like it's still, but I'd rather shift it away from friends versus death to, I think, what's going on here, which is recognition, which is effectiveness and usefulness. And whereas the grandfather story from the Yerushalmi that we looked at before showed someone who continued to be effective and continued to have a place in society, right? He died at the end of the Beit HaMikdash, before the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, comes into the second Beit HaMikdash, everything goes back to the way it was, and he still has a role 70 years later. And nobody says to him, we don't believe you. Here, everything has fundamentally changed on a historical level and on Honi's level. First of all, what's changed on a historical level? The second Beit HaMikdash has just been destroyed. It's 70 years later, there is no new Beit HaMikdash. The fundamental character of the Jewish people has been changed for eternity by this destruction and by the lack of a new edifice, a new institution. When Honi was alive, it was at the height of Jewish sovereignty in Jerusalem. And we don't see it here, but when Honi wakes up, most Jews have either been killed or taken into slavery. The whole institution of the Beit Midrash has been weakened. Some say it's been strengthened, but obviously there's no Beit HaMikdash for him to walk to. Now there's a Beit Midrash, and who knows if it's even the same Beit Midrash. We get a sense it is, but they've moved on. They've moved on to a post-temple reality, right? The things that they're teaching are no longer things that they need Honi to solve for them. They have to solve it on their own. They've learned to live without a Honi in their lives to bring them the last minute miracles. And so his role, both historically and fundamentally, in terms of himself, it's pug tokef, right? It's past its expiration date. There is no role for Honi, and Honi can't manage with that. Whereas the man at the beginning of the story is willing to plant and willing to seed things for future generations. Honi himself, it's his own personality. He continues obviously to have a very good relationship with God, because God listens to him immediately and causes his death, when he asks for it. But but Honi can't manage in society. If people don't recognize him, if people don't acknowledge him, if he can't have that same role in the Beit Midrash, then for him it's lost. It's all futile for him. So I know there were two questions. There's one more source I want to look at. But before we get to them, started with Julie and then Carly.
I had a couple things just relating to the daf today in Moed Katan. Was interesting. It said that, so apparently Honi's son died quite young, because
Yes.
if Honi, right, his son must have died at age 40.
That's right.
Which is
That's very good.
Really a kind of a punishment, or maybe really bad mazal, which was the other.
His son, by the way, was Abba Chilkiah. So Abba Chilkiah was also a miracle maker, and I don't know for sure what we taught. I haven't heard specifically that he died young, but based on your calculations, that would make sense.
And interestingly, that the three keys were fertility, resurrection of the dead, and rain. And then today in our daf, we discussed mazal being responsible for, I think, life, length of life, children, and parnasah. So already there are a lot of things now where the keys are in the hand of God.
Well, to add to that, Julie, if you think about it, also Honi had he had two of them, right? He had the rain, and he also has the resurrection, because the idea of sleeping for 70 years, everybody thought he was dead, and yet he comes back alive.
Yeah. And then the last thing was just that I think when we see the Honi story in Tanit, there are also a lot of other stories about people who are just very simple people who do good deeds, and they also get the rain. So there's this nice balance between, the generation of the desert needed the man, and they wanted the miracle, and they didn't have to work for their bread. But there's generations where you're more reliant on the leaders, and then there are generations where the people take a more active role, and maybe that's also the difference. Honi was the guy, the go-to guy, but there were also in Tanit, in that same chapter, the bloodletter who made sure to not have men and women together, the woman who always gave her bread immediately to the poor. A lot of stories like that. And so I think there's a tension. I mean, I think
absolutely.
we do. I think we need both. I think that we like it when the world works in the regular way, but it's also very powerful when we see Nisim.
Yes, and we know, just like what you said, the rabbis acknowledged it and accepted it and knew that there was always that, and knew when there was a purpose for it too.
Mm-hmm.
And Carly, thank you, Julie.
I'm trying to lower my hand. Here we go. Okay. So I'm just first struck by this idea of him coming into the study hall and them not recognizing him, in contrast to what we learned at the beginning when Moshe walks in and he doesn't recognize anything, but yet they cite him for the thoughts. So
Very good.
We've already seen someone, you know, the Shimon ben Shetach trying to put kind of Honi in his place by saying, you know, like, what is he like, Eliyahu Navi? And now we see again, the rabbis are saying, oh, here you are in the study hall and they don't know you. Like, you're not all that. And yet, like you said, it's interesting that we don't learn this as a part of the, you know, environmental movement in modern Judaism. It's clear why we don't. However, I'm shocked that we don't use that piece on community building. Because to have a piece of Talmud that says either friendship or death, like no one who has, if you don't have friends, you might as well die. It's like such a community building piece of Talmud. And it, again, like, I don't want to make it all about my family every week, but when you read that, it immediately reminded me of my great aunt who was in her 90s when she died. And she had also lost a son very young. You know, she had in his 40s, he died. She remained a very positive person. And it wasn't until her 90s, when all of her friends had died, that she said to me, every time I spoke to her, it's just so lonely. Like, I just don't have anyone anymore. And she was ready. Like, she personally didn't want to live anymore without knowing, even though she had children and grandchildren and whatever, the friendship piece.
Yeah. And I that's a really, you know, I've heard that before too. And I think that the counter to that and why, and, you know, the part of the story that people do like to share is the person who's willing to plant the trees for the future, even though he's not going to enjoy it. That's real community building, right? It's,
yeah, but that part is interesting, but I think it's interesting even more with the second part. Like, I feel like it's connected, and I'm glad we learned it, because I never had seen that part today. Yeah. So thank you.
It's the dark secret of the story.
No, but it's not so dark. I think it's
not. It's just,
it's realistic.
It's realistic and powerful.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think that, like, the first part makes a good kid story, whereas the second part sort of, it's borderline suicidal. So, you know, it's not as happy for kids, but we as adults can appreciate it and understand it, and especially what you said about your great aunt. Now we're going to go to, is everybody okay if we continue for another 5 minutes? Because I would love to finish Honi so that we can go on to the next Mishnayot next week. So if everybody's okay with that, if not, I'm still going to record, so it'll go onto the database. I really wanted to show you this source from Josephus, because I told you that Honi is a well-known, you know, sort of a, you know, popular story of his time. And there were lots of Honi stories you can imagine, right? Like, you know, someone, you know, everybody knows who, whatever, you know, some magician, some person who has power, everybody knows who they are today. Just like he was that kind of figure. So Josephus even relays some stories. And so Josephus is writing after the destruction of the Second Temple, around the year 100. He is Jewish by birth, but Hellenized completely, Hellenized and also Roman. And so I guess I would say secular. And he's trying to write a so to speak objective history of the Jews at that time. And it's his Antiquities of the Jews is like a phenomenal resource in terms of what was happening archaeologically and historically, and what were the inside stories that were well known to the Jews and to people in general. So I'm not going to get into the whole history because it gets really complicated, but Hyrcanus had two, who was it? Yanai? We'll get to this history when we get to Shimon ben Shetach. Yeah, let's say Yanai had two sons. Hyrcanus, no, but I think Hyrcanus was Yanai. Hyrcanus, let's say there was a Choshmonai king who had two sons. who then waged civil war. And this was still happening at the time of the Second Temple. Josephus is relating it. Josephus did not witness this, but he relates it. So he's writing, let's say, at least 50 years later, 60 years later, maybe even 100 years later. Hyrcanus and Aristobulus are fighting against each other, and they wanted to bring in someone to cut. Each side wanted to bring in who could help. Someone has it. John Hyrcanus, Alexander Yanai, but who is their father? So, Alexander Yanai was the father of John Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Got it. Alexander Yanai. Okay. I thought it was Hyrcanus Yanai, but yeah, you're right. Okay, thank you. So we can, skip most of this. After these promises had been given to Aretas, he made an expedition against Aristobulus with an army of 50,000 horse on foot and beat him in the battle. And when after that victory, many went over to Hyrcanus as deserters, Aristobulus was left desolate and fled to Jerusalem, upon which the king of Arabia took all his army and made an assault against the temple and besieged Aristobulus therein, the people still supporting Hyrcanus. So Hyrcanus seems to be winning the war and assisting him in the siege while none of the priests continued with Aristobulus. So Aretas united the forces. So we can, we'll get to some of this when we get later in Pirkei Avot. As this happened at the time when the feast of unleavened bread was celebrated, so we're talking about Pesach, which is when our story in the Bavli takes place, which we call the Passover, the principal men among the Jews left the country and fled into Egypt. Now there was one whose name was Onias, who is Honi. Honi was connected to this. Onias was also a historical figure, but a lot of people say Honi and Onias were the same person. A righteous man was he, like Rabbi Yochanan called him a tzaddik. So Josephus picks up on that also. He was a righteous man, beloved of God, right? We saw that, who in a certain drought had prayed to God to put an end to the intense heat, and whose prayers God had heard and had sent them rain. This man had hid himself because he saw that this sedition would last a great while. What was the sedition? It was the civil war between Aristobulus and Hyrcanus. However, they brought him to the Jewish camp and desired that by his prayers, he had once put an end to the drought, so he would in like manner make imprecations on Aristobulus and those of his faction, right? So Hyrcanus is basically winning the war. Everybody's deserted Aristobulus. And so they're like, let's be done with this. Let's end the war. Hey, I know who we can bring. Let's bring Honi. He'll save the day. Now notice this man had hid himself because he saw that sedition would last a while. So in this story, according to Josephus, there's no Rip Van Winkle. Honi just ran away. And he didn't want anything, for probably righteous reasons and also self-preservation reasons. He didn't want to have anything to do with this. He didn't see any good coming out of this. So he just said, I'm not going to vote on this one. I'm going to sleep it out, basically. However, and when upon refusal, he refused to pray, he was known as a miracle maker and someone whose prayers were effective. He refused to pray for the death of Aristobulus. Upon his refusal and the excuses that he made, he was still by the multitude compelled to speak. He stood up in the midst of them and said, "O God, the King of the whole world, since those that stand now with me are thy people, and those that are besieged are also thy people and thy priests, I beg of you, I beseech you, that you will neither hearken to the prayers of those against those, nor bring to effect what these pray against those." So what is he basically saying? He's saying, God, he has this relationship with God. Josephus is acknowledging it. And finally, they pull him out. He doesn't want to be a part of it. But finally, like Balak, like Bilam in the story of Balak, he's forced to say something. It's almost like it comes out of him. He's forced to say something. And he says, God, don't listen to either of these people, because this one wants to kill this one, and this one wants to kill this one, and they're all your people. So don't listen to any of them. What happens to him? Whereupon such wicked Jews as stood about him, as soon as he made this prayer, they stoned him to death. Powerful, right? So I think in Josephus, we're seeing a culmination of all of these strands, of all of these stories. In the Bavli story that we just read, he falls asleep, he's not there, and nobody recognizes him, and he prays for his own death. Here, he has a much more, I think, a much more justifiable approach to what's happening. He's pulled out yet again to cause some sort of miracle, and he refuses. And he's honest with God and says, "Oh, don't listen to any of them." And then he's killed. And Benny Lau in the book on the sages talks about this passage as basically underscoring the problem with miracle workers is that people depend on them for miracles. People depend on them and pull them out when they're necessary so that they can affect some kind of miracle or victory. But then they lose their effectiveness. They lose once they can't do what people ask them to do, nobody really wants them. And we also see that in the Bavli story, right? Once people don't know, people cannot acknowledge that he's Honi, he realizes he's gone past his expiration date. He no longer has a place in this society in terms of what his role is. Let's just see. He won't encourage the civil war. Yes, okay, great. So there's one last thing I want to end with, and we're not going to go into depth because this is a story that's going to come up for us, I believe, upcoming. But to me, when I read these stories together, it also reminds me of another famous story about someone who's able to call up the divine. And I think that it says both the rabbis, Shimon ben Shetach's response to Honi, and also what happens in the story when he comes back alive and he goes back to the Beit Midrash, and nobody even says to him, "Hey, what happened to you?" or "Really, you're Honi." They just say, they dismiss him. They have no role for him. They don't say, "Hey, if you're really Honi, why don't you solve some problems for us?" They don't engage him at all. It reminds me very much of the famous story of Rabbi Eliezer Hyrcanus that happened after Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was a student of Shammai. He was not of Shammai directly, but he was a student of Beit Shammai. And we're going to see a lot of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel because we're going to get to their statements in the Pirkei Avot later. Shammai, as you probably know, was known to be very, very strict when it came to halakha and not using a lot of rules of interpretation. So everything sort of had a literal, straightforward kind of meaning. Beit Hillel was known for being a little bit more creative and a little bit more out there in their interpretations. There also were ideological and characteristics that were different between the yeshivot of Beit Shammai and the yeshivot of Shammai and the yeshiva of Hillel. And so today, since the closing of the Talmud, 9 times out of 10, we follow Hillel as opposed to Shammai. Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was known as a very, very strict reader of halakha and also having tremendous memory. There was never a halakha that he forgot. So he had an argument. This is at the end of the second Beit HaMikdash, so really around the same time as the Honi story. He had an argument with the rabbis in the Sanhedrin, in the Beit Midrash, and it had to do with the oven of Aknai. Someone had brought in an oven and wanted to know if the oven was tameh or tahor, and I can't remember who said what, which actually doesn't matter here. But Rabbi Eliezer said let's say he said the oven is tameh, which actually would have been a big problem because everything would have been impure from that point on. He says, no, it's impure. And the rabbis say, no, it's pure. And he starts pulling out his proofs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm right. And they say, no, you're not right. We are the majority and we hold that it is X. And he again pulls out more proofs. They say, no, you're wrong. And he starts to get very angry. And we know that he had tremendous powers because other stories come up about him. And he starts to get very angry. And he says, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree, so here we've got another carob tree, right? This carob tree will prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place and it was raised 100 cubits. And some say even 400 cubits, like that's how crazy it was. The rabbi said to him, one does not cite halachic proof from a carob tree. Doesn't matter what kind of miracles you bring to us, that's in the Hebrew, ein mevi'in raya mina charuv. You don't bring, and that's a great phrase, you don't bring proof from a carob. So then Rabbi Eliezer says to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, this stream will prove it. The water in the stream turned backwards and began flowing in the opposite direction. And they said, you don't take a raya, you don't take a proof from a stream. And I didn't quote the whole thing here. The next thing, because I would love to learn it inside with you at a different point. The next thing that happens is he says the walls of the Beit Midrash are going to cave in, and the wall actually does cave in. And, it's unclear whether people were killed. I mean, it wasn't funny. This was not hyperbole. These were tragic things that are happening. Imagine you're sitting in a Beit Midrash and there's a huge earthquake and there's things happening around you. And the rabbis stand up and say, no, you cannot prove this from any of these things. And then Rabbi Yoshua, who is usually his comrade in arms, says to him, Rabbi Yoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written, lo b'shamayim, it is not in heaven. So the Gemara asks, my lo b'shamayim, what does that have to do with any of this discussion? What does that mean? It's not in heaven. And so Rabbi Yirmiyah says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a bat kol. I'm sorry, I forgot the last thing, which is that Rabbi Eliezer says, I will bring a divine voice. I will bring a bat kol to prove that I am right. And a bat kol, the divine voice of God, actually comes and says, the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, you fools. Don't listen to Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Yeshua says, we don't prove anything with a bat kol. God has nothing to do with halacha, because it says in Devarim, lo b'shamayim, it is not in heaven. So we are the ones who decide halacha, not you, Rabbi Eliezer, with your miracles and with your supernatural acts. And so I feel like this is so interesting in terms of looking at the Honi stories. It's very different insofar as Rabbi Eliezer is just pulling things out of his hat to prove a point. But really, but Rabbi Yeshua's argument against him is, no, we don't involve divine will when it comes to halacha. Halacha is a completely human endeavor. We make the rules, and we make the rules based on precedent and based on majority. In this case, between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, it's based on majority, right? None of them had a precedent. None of them could pull a proof from the Torah. So it was Rabbi Eliezer versus the majority, and they said, we might be wrong, it doesn't matter, we are right. And so, again, going back to what Carly mentioned, it reminds us of that first passage with Moshe sitting in the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Akiva, and his students say, where do you get this from, Rabbi Akiva? And Rabbi Akiva says, oh, it's halacha l'Moshe Misinai. It's a halacha we learned from Moshe. And Moshe's like, oh, I don't remember learning that, but still feels like, okay, I don't need to be the one who's teaching eternal halacha. It's going to be these people. It's going to be these people who are going to continue to develop halacha and decide legislation. And I just want to end with a very interesting, and I think just puts a cap on our whole discussion. The very last line of that Gemara about Rabbi Eliezer is, Rabbi Natan encountered Eliyahu. Okay, so here we go. Eliyahu is back in the story, and Rabbi Natan, after all of this happens, Rabbi Natan encounters Eliyahu, who's always around at these times, and says, what did HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what did he do at the time when Rabbi Yeshua said, lo b'shamayim, it's not in heaven? And Eliyahu says to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me. And clearly was happy about that. So I think that's a really nice way of ending this discussion. And I think that also, if you think about the idea of my children have triumphed over me, it also relates back to the idea of Honi and how Shimon ben Shetach said, you're like a child to God, right? Like God is so proud of you. God spoils you so much that he'll listen to anything you say. And now we have the opposite, right? God is so excited to see that you are able to counter divine arguments using your God-given seichel, your God-given wisdom, that's a triumph, that in the end, I'm proud of you for that. And I think we've all had situations like that where your kids say something, you're like, yeah, you're right. And you're kind of happy about it as well. Yes, Carly.
I just think this is always so funny to me, because here you have this entire passage about all these miracles, all these amazing things. And they're like, no, we don't care. And then the voice of the divine comes and they're like, it's not in heaven, right? This is not about God. We decide, but they can't end it without saying like, God is proud of us. Like they still bring it back to this piece of like, even though we just asserted ourselves and we're so independent, we're going to make all the halachic decisions. They're like, oh, but this is what God wants. And
Right.
it's always so funny that that's how it closes.
Yeah, exactly. Great. So we got through a lot today. Thank you for your patience and sticking through it. And I'm going to stop the recording now. Okay.